When you think about samurai battles, what comes to mind? The iconic clash between Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen at Kawanakajima? The hail of bullets that were rained upon the fields of Nagashino? Or the climactic final duel between East and West that was the Battle of Sekigahara? We all know samurai battles, and in our heads we each have a ranking of them, which one we generally consider to be the greatest. No doubt the answer is different for a lot of us. And personally, I think a lot of that comes from simply the term great or greatest. Saying something is the greatest incorporates many factors. Specifically talking about battles, it incorporates not only the importance of the battle when it comes to how it affected history, but also the size of the clash, the amount of casualties, who fought there, and even lasting effects that the battle had on the evolution of warfare. So today I'm going to make another top 10 list regarding samurai battles, but instead of just judging each battle based on simply its size and scale, I want this list to focus more on just how important it was for the course of Japanese history. How each battle not only affected the country, but what it is also remembered for. Simply put, this is my ranking of the top 10 most important samurai battles of all time. Now, normally this is the point where I would say that I know each of us have our own opinions regarding what we believe to be the most important, and that your answers may be very different from mine. While I always encourage a solid discussion in the comments section, I will say that a bit of this video will be actually taking aim at some other rankings of samurai battles or simply famous battles throughout world history that I myself have disagreed with. Rankings of battles that have appeared in books and websites stating that some samurai battles are more significant than others. And I will let you know more about what I mean once we start getting into those battles in this list. But for now, just know that this video is as much my own commentary on other lists I have seen as it is to your own comments on this or any of my other top 10 videos. Also, before we get started, I want to make it clear that this list will only include battles between samurai. Thus, I will not be discussing any conflicts from any war outside of Japan, such as, say, the Imjin War. But with that said, let's dive in, starting off with number 10. The Siege of Kawagoe Castle. Although not a massive or major battle that had a huge effect on samurai history overall, the clash at Kawagoe is remembered for other significant factors. Factors relating to ingenuity, loyalty, and unorthodox tactics, the likes of which would cement its mark on history. In 1546, a massive coalition of 85,000 Uesugi and other aligned forces had marched against the Hojo and besieged the castle of Kawagoe, located in Musashi Province. With only a meager 3,000 men under the command of Hojo Tsuneshige garrisoned within the castle, its fall was all but certain. Yet, in a desperate attempt to break the siege, Hojo Ujiyasu, the Lion of Sagami, marched out from Odawara with only 8,000 men at his back, and a truly unique plan. Although vastly outnumbered, he would rely upon a night attack to take the Uesugi by surprise. But surprise would not be enough. To truly seize the advantage against his enemies, he would have to rely on an incredibly rapid assault, not just from his forces but also from coordinating with the garrison of the castle. Sneaking a messenger inside of Kawagoe, Ujiyasu revealed his plan to Tsuneshige. At night, the Hojo attack would commence. Yet in order to guarantee swiftness, Hojo soldiers would be forbidden to take the heads of their fallen enemies. This was huge. Head-taking was an integral part of samurai warfare, as it not only displayed proof of service, but also was how samurai and ashigaru were rewarded for their actions. To not be allowed to take heads would be denying his army chances at seizing honor and glory. You see, head-taking was an aspect of warfare that slowed down the pace of battle, as soldiers would usually take the time to remove a head right after the enemy was slain. To eliminate this process would go to speed up the fight entirely. Surprisingly, the samurai and ashigaru of the Hojo did not become too angered by this order, and the assault went off perfectly, completely overwhelming and crushing the Uesugi, driving them from the field. This battle is so significant because it went so successfully and drastically against the norms of samurai warfare, achieving a powerful victory that would allow the Hojo clan to maintain their dominance over the Kanto region. Number 9. The Battle of Minatogawa. During the brief years of the Kinmu Restoration, when after toppling the Kamakura shogunate, the Emperor Go-Daigo was attempting to establish his new government. Although he would end up coming into conflict with the very same samurai who had previously fought for his cause against the shogun. Ashikaga Takauji had been one of the primary leaders who had aided Go-Daigo in his victory, yet now he had become the main opposition against the emperor. And although his war against the imperial loyalists would begin rather poorly, eventually he became a major threat with a massive samurai following. Of those who still stood alongside the emperor, no one is more remembered than the legendary figure of Kusunoki Masashige, often seen as the father of Japanese guerrilla warfare and shinobi tactics. He would attempt to counsel Go-Daigo on how to best combat the threat of the Ashikaga. Yet when Takauji was marching a new force on Kyoto, Masashige pleaded with Go-Daigo to flee the capital and go into hiding on Mount Hiei, where from there, Kusunoki and his forces could corner the Ashikaga in the capital and in time destroy them. Unfortunately, his words fell on deaf ears, as Go-Daigo would never willingly surrender Kyoto. Instead, Kusunoki and his army were sent out to do battle with the Ashikaga at the Minato River, where they battled against a force twice their size. It was a futile clash, as the imperial loyalists were crushed, paving the way for Ashikaga Takauji to take Kyoto and establish his new shogunate. Yet we remember Minatogawa not only for that, but more so as a legendary last stand that saw Kusunoki Masashige become a heroic imperial martyr and symbol of unwavering loyalty to the emperor for generations to come. Number 8. The Siege of Osaka. Following the Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600 that led to Tokugawa Ieyasu establishing his new Tokugawa shogunate within Edo, he allowed the survival of the family that had led the previous regime, the Toyotomi, specifically the son and heir of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a young boy named Hideyori. In time, it became clear that Hideyori was a symbol to flock to for those affected in unfortunate ways, not only by the Battle of Sekigahara, but also by the new Tokugawa government. While many of these samurai were faithfully loyal to the Toyotomi name, many others were simply joining up to end the Tokugawa clan, which had caused them such strife. And as their numbers continued to grow, Ieyasu realized he needed to finally march on Osaka Castle, Hideyori's power base, and put an end to his family once and for all. This would culminate in the Winter Siege of Osaka in 1614 and the Summer Siege in 1615, and what I want to focus on here more than anything else is the final clash that would occur at Tennoji. The Siege of Osaka alone was one of the largest samurai conflicts ever, but Tennoji in particular was the climactic end that no one was expecting, yet was still so iconic and consistent for the rest of the period. Following the battle among the tombs of the dead emperors at Domyoji, the Toyotomi loyalists were pushed back all the way to the fields before Osaka Castle. Yet it is here that Sanada Yukimura would make his glorious last stand. Throughout the winter and summer siege of Osaka, Yukimura had been a stiff thorn in the side of the Tokugawa, and it was here he would nearly achieve a surprising victory against Ieyasu. After denying Ieyasu his strategically important position on Chaosuyama, for a time, Yukimura held advantage on the battlefield, pushing the Tokugawa forces back, as they had not even yet had the chance to form up. And as the battle continued, things began to look even more grim for the Tokugawa, as on the left side, a failed attempt to flank the Osaka forces resulted in an accidental clash between two separate portions of the Tokugawa army. In a panic and in aims to help fix the situation, Ieyasu himself, only accompanied by one lone attendant, rode out to give orders directly. However, as the battle began to swing back in favor of the Tokugawa as more soldiers began to pour into the fight, all hope began to fade for the Toyotomi. Finally realizing this, and seeing Ieyasu still out alone, Yukimura and his guard made a final heroic charge that nearly succeeded in killing Ieyasu himself, as Yukimura's blade is rumored to have come just inches from Ieyasu. Hell, in some stories it is even said that he even wounded him, and in the most wild version, he actually succeeded in killing him. Yet in reality, Ieyasu was able to escape, and Yukimura would be surrounded and slain. Osaka Castle would fall. Nevertheless, this final clash would be remembered for a multitude of reasons. not only for capping off the siege of Osaka Castle, but for how things nearly fell apart for the Tokugawa, with Ieyasu almost losing his life, and the solidification of the heroic legend that is Sanada Yukimura. Number 7. The Battle of Yamazaki. Often overlooked, I feel that the Battle of Yamazaki is one of the more important clashes throughout the Sengoku Jidai, Japan's age of warring states. In 1582, Akechi Mitsuhide had succeeded in doing the unthinkable, assassinating Oda Nobunaga at the height of his power and close to his ultimate aim of unification. In the following couple of weeks, he had attempted to establish a new regime to take the place of the last. He even tried to name himself the new shogun. Of course, he now found himself surrounded by many enemies, from the Tokugawa in the east to the Shibata to the north and the Hashiba to the west. He knew a challenge to his authority would come imminently, yet by who was still unknown. Finally, it became clear that Hideyoshi, fresh off of his war against the Mori in the west, had made record time on a forced march back towards Kyoto. And although originally the combined sizes of their armies were somewhat similar, as Hideyoshi marched, his numbers continued to grow as more flocked to who they saw as the legitimate side. Their forces would meet at Yamazaki, and although now outnumbered, if Mitsuhide could hold his defensive positioning, he would surely win the day. However, he misjudged the terrain and realized all too late the importance of the nearby hill known as Tenozan. As fighting began, he sent a detachment to claim it, yet he would be ultimately repelled by Hideyoshi's forces. In the end, his disadvantage continued to grow until finally his army fully broke and began to rout, eventually resulting in Mitsuhide's sad death. What is so important about this battle is how it would affect the future of Japan. Had Hideyoshi been defeated by Mitsuhide, it would have added legitimacy to his cause, as the Akechi regime would be further solidified. Yet a far worse outcome would be if somehow the battle turned out to be inconclusive, plunging the Sengoku Jidai into who knows how many more decades of chaos. Hideyoshi's victory at Yamazaki would allow him to piece the central regime back together and embark on his own path to unite the nation. Number 6. The Fourth Battle of Kawanakajima. During the warring age of the Sengoku Jidai, there is no more iconic duel than the chess match that played out over the 5 battles between Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen. As Shingen continued to expand his reach northward, he aimed to seize the entirety of Shinano province before pushing into Echigo. By the start of Shingen's campaigns in Shinano, we can see a much weaker force occupying Echigo, a divided Uesugi clan faced with internal dilemma. However, by 1551, the Uesugi had been united and emboldened by their new leader, Uesugi Kagetora, later known as Kenshin. By the time Shingen had nearly conquered all of Shinano, he would soon face retaliation from Kenshin and the Uesugi army, who were determined to halt the Takeda advance. From 1553 to 1564, Kenshin and Shingen would continually clash over the no-man's land that was the Kawanakajima plain, with each of the clashes proving to be somewhat inconclusive to the overall conflict. However, what is remembered more than anything else is the climactic Fourth Battle in 1561, the only battle of their conflict that actually saw a massive engagement between their two armies. This battle would not only be remembered for how it poetically played out, but also for the fact that it would go down as one of the bloodiest battles in all of samurai history. By 1561, the situation in Kawanakajima had evolved into a stalemate of positioning and castles. For a time, both sides had been absent from their struggle and were instead dealing with other pressing matters. For Kenshin, he was deep into a separate war against the Hojo. Yet, during this campaign, he would catch wind of a new plot by the Takeda to strike north while he was absent. Kenshin quickly moved back to the Kawanakajima plain, arriving before any Takeda force had even made an appearance. Yet Shingen was soon notified of Kenshin's position and also rushed up to meet him. Kenshin moved to establish himself upon Mount Saijo, and as the Takeda army made their way into the plain, a new stalemate set in. Finally, Shingen would move right under Kenshin's nose and march right into the Takeda fortress of Kaizu. It is here the Takeda commander Yamamoto Kansuke would devise his famous woodpecker strategy to lure Kenshin off of the mountain and into the jaws of the Takeda army. Yet once things began, it was discovered Kenshin had already left the mountain and instead began to assault Shingen's portion of the army upon the plain. Things looked grim for the scattered Takeda army, and Kenshin would even engage Shingen in a brief 1-versus-1 melee. Yet, as the Takeda force that was supposed to attack Mount Saijo began to rush down and join the fight, the Uesugi became outnumbered and were forced to withdraw. Thus, although the Takeda technically won the battle on the field, regardless, the meat grinder that was the battle did so much damage to both sides that neither could continue on for some time, once again resulting in an inconclusive result. Looking back, it is probably this massive fourth battle that would cement the legacy of Kawanakajima in stone, as a legendary clash between two respected adversaries. In time, the battle would be heavily romanticized as one of the most iconic samurai clashes of all time. Number 5. The Battle of Toba Fushimi. This battle can be seen as the one that sealed the fate for the Tokugawa shogunate, and even the samurai as a whole. In January of 1868, Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu had already given much power back over to the emperor, yet his samurai government remained prominent nonetheless. This continued to cause further tension as the imperial loyalist Shimazu family of Satsuma and the Mori family of Choshu began pressing against the influence of the shogun. Facing increased threat from their domains, Yoshinobu ordered a shogunate army to set out from Osaka in aims to seize Kyoto and free the young emperor Meiji from the influence of Satsuma and Choshu. Yet before the shogun's army would stand a combined imperial loyalist force from Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa. For 4 days they battled in what had become Japan's most modern conflict yet. It is said the shogunate army outnumbered the imperial loyalists 3-1, yet records indicate that the shogunate forces were sorely lacking in the means to actually fight. Although equipped with modern rifles and artillery, there was a stunning lack of actual ammunition present for the shogun's forces. They simply did not stack up to the level of ready-to-use modern weaponry that the imperial soldiers had at their disposal, especially from the forces of Choshu. By the second day of fighting on the 28th of January, Emperor Meiji officially declared Shogun Yoshinobu and his forces enemies of the state. A decree that not only lowered the loyalty of the shogunate, but also caused prominent clans to switch sides to support the emperor. It was clear that legitimacy now rested with the imperial cause. And although the battle would continue on for 2 more days, the shogun's forces were on the back foot and eventually defeated. The Battle of Toba Fushimi would be the spark that lit the fuse to the end of the reign of the shogunate. The Boshin War would continue to rage on for another year and a half, and as we know, the emperor would in the end fully be restored to power as the shogun was soundly defeated. Yet it is important to stress that the overall victory of the imperial forces was heavily influenced by the events of the Battle of Toba Fushimi, the first battle of the Boshin War, and the one that sealed its fate. Number 4. The Battle of Okehazama. Not necessarily a battle in the same sense as the other entries in this list, but Okehazama remains one of the most important and impactful clashes in Japanese history. By 1560, the Sengoku Jidai had been raging for almost 100 years, as clans across the country all fought tooth and nail for regional dominance. War spread like wildfire, a plague that consumed all in its path, ravaging provinces and truly becoming the most chaotic period in Japanese history. Although even then, no one had yet dreamed of ending the violence, as most daimyo used the warring nature of the age to embark on countless offensives to expand their territorial holdings. Finally, by 1560, an unorthodox leader by the name Imagawa Yoshimoto, who sat in a strong position in the east, decided he would be the one to march on the capital, either seizing it to puppet the shogunate or to take it for himself, where from there he could unite the land. In his path west sat only minor clans that could be judged as no more than speed bumps on his way to Kyoto. Yet as fate would have it, the first province he would have to make his way through would be where disaster would strike. Owari Province was home to the Oda clan, a family that the Imagawa had clashed with before and was now under the new leadership of a man many considered to be a fool, Oda Nobunaga. Although the first stages of the Imagawa march into Owari went smoothly, completely crushing any Oda resistance, Nobunaga would in the end ignore the advice of all of his senior retainers and launch a risky night attack on Yoshimoto's position. Yoshimoto, having stopped for the night at a location known as Okehizama to take the time to go through a formal head viewing ceremony, was completely caught off guard by the abruptness and sheer audacity of the Oda attack. And although it is debated where Yoshimoto actually was killed, it does not change the fact that Nobunaga won a heroic victory at Okehizama, completely crushing the Imagawa forces and causing them to flee from the province. This would not only allow Nobunaga to go on to embark on his own journey to unite the land, but also allow Matsudaira Motoyasu to reclaim his home province of Mikawa from the Imagawa, and in time forge his new Tokugawa clan. Okehizama would be remembered as one of the most pivotal moments in the Sengoku Jidai and Japan's history as a whole, setting the nation on track for its eventual unification. Number 3. The Battle of Nagashino. This is by far one of the most important battles throughout the history of the Sengoku Jidai, and more importantly, samurai history as a whole. So much so that it often gets labeled as the most important battle in Japanese history. In fact, this is what I was referring to at the beginning of this video, the fact that I so often see this battle ranked so high, higher than other battles I feel are just as, if not more, significant. Nevertheless, what occurred at Nagashino is still easily one of the most important battles in world history. That much is true to say. By 1575, the Oda clan was nearly at the height of its power under Oda Nobunaga. Yet to the east still sat his toughest challenge yet, the mighty Takeda. Previously, Takeda Shingen had masterfully led his clan into prominence, and in 1573 had answered Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki's pleas for aid against the Oda. In his march, he would not only win a momentous victory at Mikatagahara, but also unfortunately take ill later on his warpath and eventually die, depriving the Takeda of their legendary leader. For 2 years, the Oda and Takeda backed off, as the Takeda clan was reconsolidated under Shingen's successor, his son Takeda Katsuyori. In 1575, he would set out again, inheriting his father's ambition to defeat Nobunaga and seize the capital, a triumph which, if realized, may have even led to the establishment of a Takeda shogunate. Unfortunately, after a series of speed bumps along his march, his army would decide to lay siege to the minor castle of Nagashino, a fortification which, against all odds, continued to hold out against Katsuyori's assaults. Finally, after receiving word from a samurai who managed to sneak out of the castle, Oda and Tokugawa forces would arrive to meet the Takeda army. It is here Oda Nobunaga would implement an interesting tactic that would come to revolutionize samurai warfare, erecting walls of palisades and placing lines of matchlock gunners behind them. He would wait for the famed Takeda cavalry to charge his position. Although Katsuyori's top advisors would plead with him to either withdraw or adopt a different strategy, his pride was on the line, and he would come to the decision to take the offensive and do battle. As we know, however, even thousands of the famed Takeda demon cavalry could not do much in the face of a hail of bullets that continually cut them down. After fighting all day, the Takeda would be completely crushed and forced to retreat. In the end, they would never recover from their loss at Nagashino, and 7 years later, Nobunaga would finally wipe them out once and for all. Nagashino is remembered for not only the stunning victory that Nobunaga won against the Takeda, eliminating them as a threat and allowing his regime to continue to unify the land, but also for the way his tactics revolutionized samurai warfare. From this point on, matchlocks would be more heavily used in samurai battles, more so than ever before, as soldiers would come to form up in devastating firing lines, influenced by Nobunaga at Nagashino. Number 2. The Battle of Dan-no-Ura. Dan-no-Ura is extremely significant to not just the evolution of the samurai, but Japanese history as a whole, which would go on to spawn countless myths and folktales. In 1185, the Ginpei War was in its fifth and final year. The Taira clan, which had once dominated the capital, had been pushed west, and the Minamoto had sorted out most of their internal strife and turned to finish off their final enemy. In the spring of that year, both forces would amass their fleets in the Shimonoseki Strait, off the coast between Honshu and Kyushu, and fight their last legendary clash. Although the Minamoto forces under the command of the war hero Minamoto Yoshitsune were much larger, the Taira sought a defensive strategy utilizing currents and the wind. What is interesting to note is the appearance of samurai naval battles such as Dan-no-ura, which actually appeared much like land battles, with samurai leaping from ship to ship, engaging in cramped skirmishes on board the decks of each vessel. Although early on it appeared that the Taira strategy would actually work, eventually the winds and the tides would turn against them, allowing the Minamoto to swarm the Taira forces. With all hope fading, the would-be child Taira Emperor Antoku would be taken in the arms of his grandmother, who leapt with him overboard to drown them in the bloody waters below. Following in their example, the surviving loyal Taira samurai began to drown themselves in stunning fashion as well, preferring to take their own lives and sink to the bottom of the sea rather than be killed by the Minamoto. The Minamoto would triumph at Dan-no-ura, leading to the eventual establishment of the first shogunate in Kamakura, where Shogun Minamoto Yoritomo would see Japan come under the rule of the samurai, who would rule the country for roughly the next 7 centuries. Today, the sacrifice of the Taira samurai at Dan-no-ura is remembered through various songs and folktales. Yet, one of the most interesting occurrences is strange markings which have come to appear on the backs of crabs found in the area. Markings that appear to be the faces of the Taira samurai who died that day. Number 1. The Battle of Sekigahara. There is no samurai battle more grand or significant than the massive clash fought in the year 1600 at Sekigahara, a battle that would usher in the final years of the Sengoku Jidai and go on to install Tokugawa Ieyasu as the new shogun. In 1598, after the disastrous Imjin War and a host of other political decisions that had slowly eroded at his popularity, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died. Seeing the opportunity ripe to finally seize the country for himself after years of waiting and scheming, Tokugawa Ieyasu began pressing against Toyotomi loyalists who wished to continue the Toyotomi regime and dominate it for years to come, in particular, a figure known as Ishida Mitsunari. Over the next 2 years, both Ieyasu and Mitsunari waged a war of politics and shrewd diplomacy in attempts to secure allies for the eventual war to come. And finally, by the year 1600, 2 factions had formed. A western faction comprised of Toyotomi loyalists under Ishida Mitsunari, and an eastern faction comprised of those loyal to the strongest power in the country, the Tokugawa, along with others who had become disenchanted with the Toyotomi regime. Finally, in late October, after a series of clashes leading up to the much larger and major engagement, both armies would meet in the field near the small village of Sekigahara. Their battle would decide the fate of the country. Although they shared somewhat similar numbers, the true X factor remained reinforcements that were lacking on the Tokugawa side, thanks to a blunder by Ieyasu's son who foolishly attacked the Sanada castle of Ueda. But even more so was the question of the other clans on the field at Sekigahara, whose intent was still somewhat ambiguous. No one really knew what was going to happen, and many were still afraid that they would choose the wrong side in the end and pay the ultimate price for it. There was no more questionable figure than Kobayakawa Hideaki, who, although positioned himself along with the Western Army, had yet to truly make up his mind on who he was really fighting for. His decision would decide the fate of the battle. As the clash began, a hard-fought melee ensued over the plain, yet eventually the Tokugawa began gaining the upper hand. Had the Kobayakawa at this very moment joined the fight alongside the Western Army, the Tokugawa may very well have been pushed back. Yet Ieyasu would decide to test the resolve of Hideaki, ordering his troops to begin firing upon the Kobayakawa position. This single action caused Hideaki to panic and switch sides to the Tokugawa, as he ordered his forces to smash into the flank of the Western general Otani Yoshitsugu. Quickly, the Western army became overwhelmed and defeated. Sekigahara would go down in history as the battle that ushered in a new era for Japan. as soon after the Tokugawa Shogunate would come to rise, the final and strongest of Japan's 3 shogunates. It was a massive battle at the turn of the century, featuring the largest collection of important Sengoku Jidai samurai there ever were gathered on the same field. The most momentous and intense samurai struggle that set the fate of Japan on the edge of a knife. What followed the battle would be the Edo period, a 265-year-long reign of peace and isolation that would inevitably be brought to an end at the hands of the same families that were defeated at Sekigahara. This is the most influential and important battle in Japanese history, easily one of the most significant battles throughout all of world history. And this is where I wanted to go on my own little rant. So often do I see Nagashino listed as the most important samurai battle of all time, and more so one of the most important battles in world history, while Sekigahara is not. While Nagashino was easily the far more influential battle in terms of samurai warfare, in terms of the overall impact it had on the history of Japan, the sheer size of the forces, and the massive amount of significant samurai figures present at the battle, Sekigahara is by far the more prominent. That is why it is the #1 greatest and most important samurai battle of all time, and should easily make any list that discusses the greatest battles throughout world history. So yes, that is my ranking of the most important samurai battles of all time. As always, I'm sure you have your own ideas of what the top 10 samurai battles are, so please leave me your thoughts and personal rankings in the comments below. I'd love to see what you guys think. But with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting.